Sorry.
Okay. So hi everyone, and thank you so much for coming to my presentation. And as it's already been said, I'll be discussing a comparison of bank swallows between exodus sites as well as lakeshore sites. And so, as everyone here knows, bird populations around the world have been increasing in population declines. And in Canada, while some species, or some guilds of species, have been seeing increases thanks to many conservation efforts, others are experiencing very drastic population declines. And aerial insectivores is a specific guild that has been experiencing the steepest and most constant population declines since the 1970s. And apart from feeding on flying insects, another trait that many species within the aerial insectivore guild have in common is their use of man-made structures and anthropogenically modified habitats, and so as nesting areas. And so some of these can be described as substitute habitats. And these basically are man-made structures or landscapes that are created for human use that just by chance are partial substitutes for the species' original nesting habitat. And so chimney swifts are actually a great example of this. And so chimneys were created with the intent of home ventilation, but just by chance they happened to be perfect nesting habitat for the species. And so bank swallows, what I'm working on, are another great example of aerial insectivores that use substitute habitats. And so historically, in their natural habitat, bank swallows would breed in deep burrows that they excavated themselves within very tall, vertical, sandy banks along oceans, rivers, lakesides, and streams. And so the faces of these cliffs are maintained by wind and water erosion, and this keeps them vertical and also keeps them fresh enough so that the birds are able to penetrate into them and create their burrows. In Ontario, it's the availability of these natural nesting habitats that is perhaps the most limiting habitat requirement due to both the rise of erosion control measures that are placed along these to help with property control or not losing property, and also continued low lake levels along the Great Lakes, which basically doesn't allow erosion, and so these areas will harden and they won't be penetrable by the birds anymore. And according to the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or CSIWIC, these birds have been experiencing a population decline of 98% since 1970. And so they have been listed within the last 2 years as threatened on our Species at Risk Act. And it's this lack of the suitable breeding habitat that's thought to be driving this population decline. And so this is where substitute habitats come in. Within the last century, there's been an increase of the excavation of sand and gravel, and I'll be referring to this as aggregate sites. And this has increased the availability of these vertical sandy cliffs more inland away from the water. And so many colonies of bank swallows have been found nesting at these sites. And unlike their natural sites, which are maintained by wind and water erosion, these sites are mainly maintained by the operators themselves through the movement of gravel, through the extraction of gravel, creating vertical faces. And so while we do have information on bank swallows using these sites, we know that they use them. We have an idea on why they choose to nest in certain banks within these sites. And we have an approximate idea of how many swallows use these inland sites. However, there hasn't actually been a study done on their reproductive success within them or a comparison between their natural habitats and these substitute ones. And so this is a knowledge gap that my project is trying to fill. And so more specifically, I sought to examine the productivity between these two site types, so lake shores and gravel pits, and the factors that might be influencing their reproductive ability. And this is especially important as substitute habitats have been noted to potentially become ecological traps for some species. And so to answer this objective, I had the following 5 sub-objectives. And so each of these are basically a response in some general linear models that I created. And so I sought to determine if there were any differences in clutch size, and then in hatching success, in the number of successful fledglings, adult and juvenile mass, and if there are any differences in adult and juvenile external parasite growth. So my study sites were located on the northwestern shore of Lake Ontario, through to the Peterborough-Kawartha region, and so this is just north of Toronto. And study sites consisted of aggregate pits as well as lakeshore sites, which is on the bottom. and set up mist nets to just try and catch as many birds. And captured birds were banded. We had their weight taken, a fat score, and a wing cord. And then in 2015, we also included the observational counting of external parasites on each of the burns. So when it came to results, we found that there was no significant difference in the clutch size between lakeshores and aggregate sites. And the same was found for the number of hatchlings. So in both site types, the same number of eggs were found and the same number of eggs hatched. However, we found a different story when it came to the number of successful fledglings. And so we found that aggregate sites actually had significantly more young produced. And so I hypothesized that this difference could potentially be related something to do with predators. So aggregate sites, we found, or we observed at least, that there were mainly mammalian predators. And so these included foxes and raccoons, who would generally depredate the lower burrows that were accessible by them to dig. So they would dig, eat the contents of the nest. And then kestrels were also on site. However, they mainly predated on already flying birds, or once the youngs fully fledged the nest, the weaker flyers would get picked on, I guess. However, on the lakeshore site, there was a greater range of these birds, and instead of being localized to the lower nests, it was more generalized to the entire bank. And so we often saw ring-billed gulls as well as grackles, and such as this ring-billed gull in this photo, and they would basically fly in front of these burrows, and the young who were at the edge of the nest waiting to be fed would get snatched up and eaten directly from the nest. And so this is something that we weren't able to actually quantify, but it would be a very interesting study to do at some point. So when it came to mass, we found that the mass of juvenile bank swallows did not differ between the lakeshore and the gravel pit. So this means that their parents, the adults, were able to appropriately feed their young on both sites. However, when it came to the mass of adults, we found an interesting trend. So on the lakeshore, the mass remained relatively stable throughout the entire season. So we began banding. This is from our banding data, and it began June 1st all the way to the end of July. And so they remained relatively stable. However, in the aggregate pits, the mass of adult bank swallows was higher at the beginning of the season, and then it significantly declined as we get towards the end of the season, which is a little bit troubling, especially in this area. If you are a later nesting bird in pits, you're able to adequately feed your young and produce more young. However, they may not be able to feed themselves in a way that can actually replace the energy spent for reproduction. And so this is the possible area of concern in gravel pits regarding ecological traps. This is especially since later nesting birds are trying to produce and then getting ready for their long migration. And so hopefully this doesn't lead to some carryover effects, but it potentially could into the next reproductive season. And so this trend is likely related to the availability of insects between the two site types. And this is corresponding to a study that one of my field assistants did. And we placed out a bunch of insect sticky traps to gauge the biomass between the two site types. And we did find that aggregate pits had lower biomass of insects than our lakeshore sites did. And it would be interesting to take this a little step further and looking at aggregate sites specifically and seeing if ones with a water source and ones without a water source had a similar trend or had a more positive trend in ones with water. And then we come to the external parasites. And so I found that adult bank swallows did not have a difference in the number of parasites that were found on them. However, the young bank swallows in pits had significantly lower parasites found. And so this could be potentially due to the refreshment of the faces. So the low lake water, or the low water on the Great Lakes is causing the erosion to be slowed down on these natural habitats, which means that the burrows that were created in the previous year are often there the next year, so they're being reused more, which means that the parasites will likely be building up in these. Whereas in the aggregate pits, the banks are oftentimes refreshed by the operators removing breeding sites. Hatching success did not. Aggregate sites had a higher number of successful fledglings. The mass of young in both sites did not differ. However, the mass in early adults was higher, but this significantly declined over time. And the number of parasites in juveniles was lower in aggregate sites. And so I believe that this leads to a great potential to aggregate pits. And they do appear to provide equal or potentially even higher habitat quality for these bank swallows than their natural sites, and this makes them important sites for conservation. And as bank swallows continue to lose their natural habitat, these substitute habitats do have the potential to provide recruits for the Ontario population. And although these are adequate breeding sites, they can be considered less stable, as banks are often destroyed for resources and only sometimes the operators replace them. And so this really stresses the importance to not only work together with these operators and these companies to create best management practices and hopefully aid in the conservation of the species. And so I would just like to thank my lab and everyone who's helped me out with this project, either financially or hand labor.
Yes, we do have time for questions.
I separated parasites into different categories, and so we had weaklings, fleas, lice, and yeah. Potentially. It could be also due to the fact that maybe there's less insects, so they do have to fly farther away to get their food. And so they just could be expending more energy to get the food to be here. There haven't been any records of bank swallows renesting here in North America.
So did these birds were recruiting a year early or something like that, or did they breed first year?
It could just be egg nesters. So we did notice that sometimes halfway through July there would be random swallows that would just enter a site and create a new colony, and so they could be ones that either might overlate, they can find a suitable habitat where they were searching until they got to our site. It could be breeders that didn't breed
Did they breed it longer?
Correct.
Did they breed first year of fledge or